Let us pray. May I speak in the name of the living God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. That was a long reading, wasn't it? Imagine how long this sermon's going to be. What time does the next service start? We might make it just in time. I have somewhat flippantly entitled my sermon, The Third Best Evangelist in the New Testament. And you'll perhaps find out why by the time we get to the end of the sermon. But for now, let me introduce you to perhaps two of the best evangelists in the New Testament, Jesus and the woman at the well. Now, the woman at the well, there could be two reasons why we don't know her name. The first reason is that she's a woman, and the second reason is that she's often hanging around at wells. That's not actually the second reason, but let's deal with the first reason first. Isn't this reading a gift at this time when last Wednesday, was the International Women's Day? International Women's Day is good and necessary for many, many reasons. And I want to give you just one reason right now. That reason is that today, 1 in 3 women in the world will experience violence. 1 in 3. It's a shocking statistic and something that we need to be reminded of and keep at the forefront of our minds. And women today are mistreated simply because they are women, and it was at least as bad in the ancient Near Middle East of Jesus' time, and maybe even worse. So we get that bit, and if you've got the Bibles there, you might want to keep your thumb in the reading, because we get that bit in verse 27 when the disciples finally catch up with Jesus, and they are stunned into absolute silence to see Jesus speaking to a woman, because that was just not the done thing at the time. A Jewish man would never speak to a woman who he didn't know. And they are so shocked to see it that we're told explicitly that none of them asked Jesus what on earth he's doing. And there's not even the slightest suggestion that any of them might have actually spoken to the woman themselves. And I don't know, asked her, what's your name? It was never going to happen. It was not the done thing. So we don't know her name. The second reason why we don't know her name is because, as well as being a woman, she's also a Samaritan. Now, buckle up, folks. We are going on a bit of a history trip here. Bear with me. At the time of Jesus, the Samaritans were a substantial religious group who lived close to where Jesus lived and ministered in the central hill country between Galilee in the north and Judea in the south. But some of them had spread out in a slightly wider area too and lived in other parts of Israel. The Samaritans believed, and they still do, because there are still Samaritans in the world today, although they are a tiny religious group, that the Samaritans believed that they were the faithful core of Israel. And the majority of Israel, the majority of the Israelites, the majority of the Jewish people began to get their practice of their faith wrong around the time of Eli. Eli was the priest at the time that Samuel was the prophet. And it was at that point that the center of worship for Israel moved from a place called Gerizim to Shiloh. And it would move eventually from Shiloh to Jerusalem. Now, don't worry if you have no idea where Gerizim or Shiloh are, nor do I, truth be told. But the issue is that the Samaritans believed that the Jewish people were wrong for making Jerusalem, not Mount Gerizim, the place where they focused their worship. So there's a bit of disagreement between the Jewish people and the Samaritans there. But the story of the Samaritans is further complicated in the eyes of the Jews by the fact that when Israel was conquered by the Assyrians, the Assyrian Empire moved in colonists. So they moved in people to the place where the Samaritans lived. And these people accepted the Samaritans' faith as their own. If you're taking notes or making mental notes, then I'm referring to 2 Kings 17:24 and the verses onwards now in the Bible. It refers to this. And the Jews believed that the faith of the Samaritans at that point had been influenced by these pagan Assyrians. And they believed that the Samaritans were heretics whose faith and practice of their religion had been influenced by people outside of Israel, outside of the people of God. But actually, that understanding is a prejudice. It wasn't influenced by the pagans at all. Now, if all of that is a little bit complicated, don't worry. All you need to know is that at the time of Jesus, the Jews really, really disliked the Samaritans. In fact, ordinarily, a Jew who had to travel from the north to the south, or vice versa, and this happened a lot when the Jews were on pilgrimage, would go a long way around from the direct route, just in order that they didn't have to physically travel through Samaria. You all know what that's like because you have all met Sheffield United fans who refuse to go to Hillsborough, to even set foot there. Such is their dislike for Wednesday fans. It was the same kind of thing. Here's one for International Women's Day for you. There was a Jewish ruling that said, and I quote, "The daughters of Samaria are menstruants from their cradle." So there was a Jewish ruling that basically said all Samaritan women are ritually unclean from the beginning of their life until the end of their life. That is how much they despised and disliked the Samaritan people. So there you have it. She's a woman, she's a Samaritan, and yet she turns out to be one of the greatest evangelists of the New Testament, who transforms her village by talking to people about Jesus. And today you will have noticed that there's not a special day in the church where we celebrate Saint Woman at the Well Day. You have not been to visit a church that is dedicated to Saint Woman at the Well. We don't know her name, and she's not really celebrated at all, and that is a very tough break for her. And let's not over-theologize that or try to explain it away. Let's not turn this sermon instead into a sermon on the use of water as a motif throughout John's Gospel. Let's look at the basic hard facts of that fact. Jesus wants to talk to all kinds of people. And Jesus wants all kinds of people to find purpose and hope in their lives. Yet somehow or other, and I'm sure present company is accepted, the church has at times made it really difficult for all kinds of people to come and meet with Jesus. All too often the church can end up looking like a museum for saints when we're actually called to be a hospital for sinners. How hard do we sometimes make it for people to encounter Jesus? A lot has been made of this woman having 5 husbands, and she's currently living with a man who's not her husband. Make of that what you will, but this morning, I'm not going to jump to sordid conclusions. I'm going to assume that this woman married young and has experienced unfortunate tragedy in her life. And I'm going to assume that some of her 5 previous husbands have died. And then I'm going to assume that some of her 5 previous husbands have divorced her and sent her on her way. Husbands in those days could divorce their wives for fairly trivial reasons. And I'm going to assume this morning that it wasn't her fault, and that she's experienced heartache and grief and rejection, and that carrying the weight of all that means that she is now in a pretty unorthodox relationship. And Jesus meets with her and sees that unorthodox relationship and looks right past it to see her broken hearts, and then does the will of the God of love and heals her broken hearts. You can assume what you will, but that's what I'm going to assume this morning. The passage is not terribly clear. And so we get this woman who perhaps wouldn't even be allowed on the coffee rota of some churches, who's given the opportunity to go back to her village and to tell people, come and see. and to ask people a question: could this be the Messiah? Has anyone got any questions at this point? We're all good. I want you to hold all of that in your minds, and I'm going to do a little related digression and ask ourselves, why should we bother with evangelism? Because we've encountered Jesus, the greatest evangelist in the New Testament. We've met with the woman at the well, perhaps in the top 5 of the greatest evangelist in the New Testament. So we're going to ask the question, why should we bother with evangelism at all? Well, perhaps we think that we ought not bother with evangelism, and it's the vicar's job. Perhaps the vicar wishes it was his or her job, but is too busy with safeguarding policies and chapter lunches to find time to do evangelism. I actually think it's probably a sad fact that most vicars probably can't remember the last time they had a meaningful conversation with anyone who doesn't already attend church. And I might include myself in that category as well. Why do we bother with evangelism? Is it a calling for all of us, and why should we do it? Well, I think the answer to the question of why we should do evangelism requires us, would you believe, to look at the use of a water motif throughout the Gospel of John. So let's go there now, shall we? After the amazing epilogue that begins John's Gospel, right in John chapter 1, then toward the end of John chapter 1, we come to the testimony of John the Baptist, who is, well, he's baptizing folks. So there's water involved there. Then we have the wedding at Cana in Galilee, where Jesus turns an amazingly huge amount of water into an amazingly huge amount of wine. Next up in John's Gospel is Nicodemus. Now, before I talk about water in the Nicodemus story, let's pause quickly to note the difference between Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman. Nicodemus is named, powerful, part of the religious elites, comes to find Jesus in the dark, and after encountering Jesus, doesn't do much evangelism, but actually goes away a little bit confused. In the encounter with Nicodemus, Jesus tells him that he must be born of water and the Spirit. So there's more water. In our reading today, Jesus tells the woman that he will provide the living water. The living water is himself. And water continues to crop up through the rest of John's Gospel. There's the stirring of the water at the pool of Bethsaida. There's another announcement that Jesus is the living water at the Festival of Booths. There's the foot washing story. There's the blood and the water from the spear hole in Jesus' side. There's Jesus who is thirsty, dying on the cross and asking for some water to drink. The eternal living water that quenches all thirst is thirsty and dying. So water is a strong theme throughout John's Gospel. And throughout John's Gospel, Jesus meets people who have real physical needs. People who might be physically thirsty or maybe need a bath. Yet somehow, some of these people who Jesus encounters transcend their physical needs and recognize that Jesus is the one who can save them from their spiritual needs. Now, I don't believe that everyone, everywhere, is spiritually seeking. Some folks are just in the crowds looking to see what's going down. But I do believe, as Jesus encountered in his ministry, that there are some in the crowds who are seeking. And they transcend their physical needs and see Jesus as the one who can save them from their spiritual needs. And so the point of evangelism is not to prove that the church is viable and correct. It's not to make sure that we get enough people in the church building to pay the parish share so that the bishop's chaplain can get paid, important as that is. It's not to sustain the artistic integrity of Western Christendom and preserve a particular way of life. We do evangelism because people are seeking and they need to have hope. And Jesus Christ is the hope of the world. That's why we do evangelism. Now, we've got a little dilemma now, because if that's why we do evangelism, and we're all of us called to do the work of an evangelist, there's no sick notes here for anyone. Even if you're wearing a clerical collar, you don't get a sick note. You've got to do evangelism. So the question is, how do we do evangelism? I'm bringing this sermon into land now, you'll be pleased to hear. And I recognize that this sermon has been mainly about evangelism, but never mind, I hope you don't mind that. How do we do evangelism? Because most of us, truth be told, shudder at the idea of sharing our faith, don't we? Be honest now, shudder at the idea. Well, I'll give you a couple of approaches to how you might do evangelism. The first is you can simply fill a football stadium, as Billy Graham did, and see what happens. It's one thing we can do. Or if that's not your cup of tea, you could do a Jesus and perhaps heal someone who's been blind from birth. That usually causes a bit of a stir, and people will begin to follow Jesus if you can do that. Failing that, I thought of one particularly contextual for all you guys. You could stand on the corner of Greystones Road and Blair Athol Road, perhaps just outside the chip shop on a Friday night, and shout at people to turn or burn. That's another way that you could do evangelism. But if none of that works, I recommend to you the approach of Saint Woman at the Well. Find someone who you already know and someone who already knows you. Invite them to come and see. Ask them a question and listen to the answer. Find someone you already know, someone who already knows you. Invite them to come and see. Ask them a question, and really importantly, listen to the answer. It's all there in John chapter 4, verse 29. Now, in my spare time, I worked for an organization called Leading Your Church into Growth, and that organization is led by one of the best evangelists I've ever met. I reckon that he wouldn't get on very well with Nicodemus. I imagine Nicodemus wouldn't get on very well with him either, to be honest. But he would get on amazingly well with Saint Woman at the Well. And he taught me the approach of the woman at the well, but in a slightly different format. And I want to commend it to you this morning if you want to go at doing evangelism. The first bit is based around that come and see. And I want to teach you a phrase this morning. The phrase is this: I'm going to this. I've heard it's going to be good. Would you like to come with me? It's a bit like come and see. I'll give you some examples. I'm going to St. Gabriel's on Easter Sunday. I've heard it's going to be good. Would you like to come with me? I'm going to the toddler group at Greystones. I've heard it's great there. Would you like to come with me? Can I give you a lift? That's pretty close to come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. And then the woman asks a question, could this be the Messiah? And I want to teach you 3 simple questions that I was taught and that really helped me in my evangelism. The first question is this: who are you? Because everyone can and likes to talk about themselves. The second question is this: where are you with God? I'll give you an example. Imagine that you're at the toddler group. You can say to someone, oh, you've come to toddler group here in this church building. Have you ever been to church on a Sunday? Have you ever thought about God? Have you ever talked to God? Have you ever prayed? That kind of thing. And then the third question is, why don't you? Why don't you come on an Alpha course? Why don't we grab a coffee sometime? Why don't you let me pray for you? Why don't you keep coming along to our toddler group, even though you are the most avowed atheist in the whole of West Sheffield? You're still welcome to come and use our church's toddler group. Who are you? Where are you with God? And why don't you? 3 really important questions, and it's really important to listen to the answers. And those questions, I think, are pretty close to the Samaritan woman's questions of, could he possibly be the Messiah? I mean, who am I trying to kid? They're nothing like that question. Could he possibly be the Messiah? But they're questions, and we do need to learn the fact that evangelism begins with questions and listening, not with telling people. Evangelism begins with questions and listening, not telling people. Somehow or other, Saint Woman at the Well instinctively gets that, and she says, come and see. She asks a question, she listens to the answer, and she sees amazing results. Not everybody gets Jesus, and that's okay, but a lot of people in her village do. And they say to Jesus, can you stay 2 more days? And I like to imagine that they stay at the house, Jesus and the disciples, the awkward ones who couldn't even talk to her and ask her what her name is. I like to imagine they stayed at the house of Saint Woman at the Well. And I like to think that Jesus bumps into her not husband. And I like to think that her not husband becomes a follower of Jesus and believes that Jesus Christ is his Savior. And then I like to think that not husband goes on to be the 3rd best evangelist in the New Testament. We're not told that, so maybe he doesn't. Maybe he just goes on to love his not wife a little bit more wholeheartedly. Maybe he's just a little bit kinder to his neighbors. Maybe he prays for folks who are in need and finds a deep joy and presence of God in those ordinary moments in life. So may we be a bit more like Saint Woman at the Well and a bit more like her not husband. Amen.